no longer individual persons, but we are a new person. And the body of the church is a new person when the people within the church are united and of one spirit, just like Jesus prayed for in John 17. I've been asked to share a few words with you about some of the things that have happened in my life. And as I am here today and as I'm speaking with you, I have already completed 85 years of my life. And that 85 years has been filled with a lot of activities. And I've seen a good deal of the world during that 85 years. Part of my time when I was in the Navy, and part of the time when I have been a missionary. And I have been in more than 70 countries of the world. I started out my life in a very small town in eastern Iowa. And I didn't know much about what my background was at that time. Most of what I know about my background I've learned since then. When I was old enough to recognize the circumstances that I was living in, my father was my parent, and I did not have a mother. And I learned eventually that my father and my mother had divorced when I was very young and had moved from Iowa to California. That is my mother and my sister and a brother. I have altogether 17 brothers and sisters, but I was raised as an only child. And the reason I have 17 brothers and sisters is because I have a birth family, I have a foster family, and I have a step family. And most of those families did not exist when I was very young. But they began to come back into my life at various times following my childhood. My father remarried when I was 7, and between the time I was 7 and 11, I had 2 parents. And then at age 11, my father had gotten quite ill, and he passed away. And at the time that he passed away, I was visited by a lady from an orphanage who wanted to come to our house to see if I was going to be taken care of. And that was the first time that I knew that my father was not my birth father. And the lady from the orphanage was there to make sure that I was being taken care of, or I would have been taken back to the orphanage. I was baptized into the church in that small town when I was 8 or 9 years of age I was a member of that church, took part in the youth fellowship activities of the church, attended church regularly. My family attended church regularly. We were a Christian family. And ultimately, I became somewhat disenchanted with what I had observed, because I learned through being in a small town that there were many of the church members that had other lives besides being church members. And there were some social issues that were not exactly approved of by the Lord and approved of by the church. And I thought at that time, somewhere I got the idea that churches were supposed to change lives. And when I saw this church that was not changing lives, I gradually kind of dropped away from it. I also moved away from that little town when I was 17, because I joined the Navy immediately out of high school, and I spent 2 years in the Navy during World War II. And then I went to college at a Christian college, and while there I was attending church, singing in the choir, taking part in church activities. I know I sang in the Messiah on 2 different years at Christmas time, because that church put on the Messiah each year at Christmas time, also with the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. taking part in that. So I had an interesting life, and I was close to God, but again, I didn't see that things were happening to people who belonged to the churches. They seemed to have somewhat the same problems with their lives and some of the same activities that were not exactly approved of by the churches. I was 30 or 40 years out of church activity, and ultimately the church in the small town sent me a registered letter and withdrew my membership because I wasn't living any longer in that community and I wasn't financially supporting that church. A number of years later, I was in Hawaii, and while in Hawaii, I found some people in an organization called Youth with a Mission. I'd never heard of this organization, but little by little I began to meet some of these people, and I found they were rather strange people. They walked around the community and God talked to them. And I'd never known people that God talked directly to until I met these people from Youth with a Mission, which is ordinarily called YWAM. And that led to a number of things that happened, and in November of 1983, I went to a family camp, and in that family camp, I recommitted my life to Jesus. The date actually is about the week from the date that we're sitting here making this recording. And after I made that recommitment to Jesus, within a year of that time, I went on, my wife and I and our daughter attended a 4-month-long lecture series known as the Crossroads Discipleship Training School. And following that discipleship training school, we went on an outreach, and the outreach took us into Asia. And the first place that we went in Asia was Singapore. And in Singapore, I found a church that was almost the same age as the church that I had been baptized into in Hawaii, about 6 years of age. And this church in Singapore already had 300 home groups. Singapore is a very, very exciting town, a very interesting town, a very small town. It's only, all of Singapore is about 12 kilometers wide and 24 kilometers long, but there were 3.5 million people there. And all of the churches in Singapore were quite active. They were all what at that time we would call charismatic churches. That included the Catholic churches, the Orthodox churches, the Methodists, the Baptists. All the churches there were charismatic. They were very active. And I saw a church that excited me because all of the members participated in that activities. I attended a number of the different home groups that were meeting in Singapore. And then from Singapore, we went to Bangkok, Thailand, and I found another church that was also an active church. And as we came there, they were starting their first satellite church, the very first one. And we were working with the church, and I was assigned to go and work at that satellite church. And while there, I saw how a satellite church, some of the benefits and some of the effects of it, the same as I saw these satellite churches, these home churches back in Singapore. And it didn't occur to me what I was seeing, except that I knew that these churches, because all the members were active, were quite different than the church that I had grown up in eastern Iowa. And By this time, of course, I had already been baptized. I was already an active member of the church. While in this outreach to Asia, excuse me, I also found out that two missionaries that were part of the organization YWAM had been found guilty of proselytism in Athens, Greece, just 2 days before Christmas in 1984. Yes, 1984. And they were sentenced to 3.5 years in prison. And I thought the circumstances were rather unusual. And I kept finding out more things about it as we traveled. Eventually, we went back to Hawaii. We completed the outreach, and we went back to Hawaii. In addition to Singapore and Thailand, we also went to Hong Kong, and we went to the Philippines. And in Hong Kong, I saw a church there that had been smuggling Bibles into China. And the year before, in '83, they had taken 8 tons of Bibles and biblical materials into China. And it was kind of laughable because they were smuggling in, and they all had backpacks, and they all looked pretty obvious to me that they were up to something, but they were being successful in getting this material into Hong Kong, into China. Hong Kong at that time was still not a part of China. It was the leasehold that was governed by the United Kingdom, by Great Britain. And I had a visa to go into China, but I had an accident in Hong Kong, and I was not able to go into Hong Kong, into China. But the thing I saw was kind of the preamble of where we are today, because China, the Christian church in China is one of the fastest growing churches in the world. And it's fast growing because materials got into China, Bibles got into China, and people came to China, many of them through Hong Kong, because that was kind of the gateway into China. And they went there and taught English, and they also told about Jesus. I found when we were in Hong Kong, we actually worked within the university there, and we went to English classes because they wanted to hear English speakers. And they were very happy for us to tell them anything that we wanted to tell them. We could give them our testimonial, and they weren't concerned about this at all, and it didn't restrict us at all. And but I learned that the largest university in the world at that time was in Hong Kong, had 500,000 students, and the Campus Crusade for Christ was working there, and we worked together with them as well. And I learned that on the Campus Crusade was only aware that there were 50 baptized believers. 50 baptized believers out of a university that had 500,000 students. The message that I have throughout all of my life is that Jesus has been active in my life, and he was active in my life even when I didn't recognize him as being my Lord and Savior. But he still was guiding my life, and I don't take these occurrences lightly. I believe that God moved me and put me in these different places because he was teaching and training me and bringing me forward to become an apostle for him. And all of this foundation and background has led me to writing a series of books which themselves is a rather long story that we don't have time for today, but the series of books begins with one that really covers all of my life that is called A Journey of Destiny and Discovery. And from that book, I invited other believers to join the journey that I had found so useful. The second book in the series is one called We Are One, because that is a central requirement for God's church, is unity and oneness. The third book is the action book, and it is called Common Sense, Consistency, Credibility, Compassion, and Celebration. And that's the action book. And the fourth book is called To the Cross. And To the Cross, of course, is the crossroads where Jesus' ministry ended and our ministry, the ministry of God's church, began. And this is a much longer story, and we can't tell it all today, but the message that I have from my life, even when I was not a Christian, God was preparing me. Even when I was struggling with not knowing whether I was a Christian or an atheist or an agnostic or what I was, God was still there and God was still preparing me. There were no coincidences. I do not believe in coincidences, but I do believe in divine appointments, and I do believe in divine assignments, because God gives me those kind of assignments and does it on a regular basis.